Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of some recent reading that I could subtitle some modern classics, maybe. How about a modernist argument type novel? This is Raduan Nassar's A Cup of Rage, which was translated by Stefan Tobler. Nassar is a really interesting author in that he was one of the big Brazilian modernist writers of the 70s, and then he quit writing to become a farmer, and I think he's still alive, he's in his 80s now, I think, and just kind of disappeared from public life, so that's interesting on its own. I call this a modernist erotic cult novel, but I think that's a little over the top because it's not that erotic. It's mostly a couple has hooked up, and when they leave the house, ants have eaten one of the shrubberies, and that makes everyone a little grumpy, so they have a really nasty fight on the street in front of the housekeeper and the gardener. I think there are a lot of novels and novellas and plays and short stories of this type that were written in mostly France and Latin America in the 70s, and this is exactly that kind of novel. So if you're a fan of that kind of thing and you haven't read this, you should absolutely be picking it up because it's almost the ideal of that, and it's super short. That is not necessarily my favorite style of writing, but it is the kind of thing where even though I don't necessarily like it, you look at it and you can recognize that is the kind of argument that you would be looking over, your fence to watch your neighbors have if they were having that argument, really biting and cutting at each other, and not literally but verbally, right? It is that kind of thing. So there's not a lot I can say about this because it is so short that without describing the actual insults, there's not much I can say, and I wouldn't want to describe them because kind of the fun of reading that is seeing what insults the couple comes up with. So yeah, if you're into that kind of thing and you haven't read that one, pick it up. Next, let's talk about something else from the 70s. Next up, I read The Ascent of Mount Fuji, which is co-written by the Kyrgyz writer Chingiz Aitmatov and the Kazakh writer Kaltai Mukhamedzhanov. This was originally published in 1973 and is set around that time. And you have 4 friends who have gone hiking up a mountain along with 3 of their wives and an old school teacher of theirs, and they are old childhood friends who are reminiscing about their school days. But as the night goes on, they start talking about which one of them could have been the person who sold out a 5th friend during the Second World War when they were in the military. And the question is, who told the authorities that this friend was writing poetry that wasn't rah-rah nationalistic at a time when everybody was, yay, great patriotic war, and their friend was writing, war is hell type poetry. And it had to have been one of them because they were the only ones who spoke Kyrgyz, and that was the language he was writing the poetry in when they were off in Europe fighting. So it builds up to this reveal that this is one of the things that they have in common in the past, and that this is what happened to this friend who appears in their childhood stories and isn't there with them now. And then in the second act, we have the next day, and then there's an additional moral quandary that pops up, which is maybe a little heavy-handed. I liked the first act, which is the bulk of the book, more than the second. This play is no longer in print in English, unfortunately. This edition that I have was from the mid-70s, and it looks longer than it is, because this is the English translation on the one side, and then the Russian original is in the back. And this book fell apart as I was reading it. But if you read either Russian or Turkish, editions are available in those, or if you come across this secondhand, I think it's really interesting, and it's a real portrait of the moment, where you could have criticism of the Soviet-era government of the 40s, but there is still this real propaganda piece about rah, we were saved from feudalism and religious belief and whatnot. So really interesting time capsule. And yeah, the first act of this I thought was fantastic. The second act, heavy-handed, but what are you gonna do? And this was translated by Nicholas Bethell. All right, so since I just alluded to Stalin's time, let's talk about something that is also about that. This is Milovan Đilas's Conversations with Stalin, which is a memoir of conversations with Stalin. Đilas was a Yugoslav politician who, prior to communism in Yugoslavia, had been a political prisoner for being communist, and then later was re-imprisoned because he was critical of the government and the direction it took. So he was a really interesting guy. Fascinatingly, when I posted about this on Instagram, somebody responded by basically calling him an untrustworthy person because he had moved to the US, which he never did. That's actually not true. Lived and died in Belgrade, although he was originally from Montenegro. And anyway, his life is interesting, and reading his other work is also interesting. But this book in particular is written years after the fact, so it shouldn't be taken as reportage, but it is a memoir of how his attitude towards the Soviet brand of communism kind of eventually ate away at his idealism regarding it as a political system. And especially in the middle point where they're talking about immediately post-liberation, when Yugoslav partisans had liberated what was then Yugoslavia, but the Red Army was still coming in and saying they were liberating, but they were raping and pillaging as things happened. And I mean, some people will argue that what Đilas reports that Stalin said in response to commenting about that might not have been true, but I think from everything that's been declassified since then, a lot of it is essentially true, so the quotes might not be right on, but it's not that far off. In any case, it is an interesting kind of time capsule again, because again, at the time, a lot of things hadn't been declassified, so this was a lot more controversial in the moment. This again is a short book, an interesting peek into the mind of a politician who was willing to shift his own opinions, because Đilas was also one of the people in the 80s who predicted what was going to happen in the 90s, because a lot of people still today will say, oh, nobody could have predicted that, but he did think that. And again, that's not this book, but what am I looking for? It was translated by Michael Petrovich. Next up, Kapuściński's The Emperor. I've talked about his writing before. He of course was the Polish journalist who was, in a lot of cases, the only Polish journalist who was allowed out of the country during a series of revolutions and wars all over the world, which is an interesting perspective. It also means, though, that a lot of his books, and this book in particular I think suffers from this, it's a translation of a translation of a translation of a translation. And so there is a bit of a game of telephone going on. This book is mostly about the last years of Haile Selassie's reign in Ethiopia, and is primarily an oral history in which he gives what are supposed to be snippets from interviews with various people who worked for the court. And none of them are really high-ranking people, because a lot of those people were executed or weren't going to talk to him. So most of the perspectives are people who have a really narrow view of what was happening. And especially at the beginning, I think that can be a little bit unsatisfying, because especially if you know more of the history, you may think, well, they're missing context. But they literally are missing context. And I think it's misjudging what an oral history is trying to do, to want the voices of somebody whose job was to hold a pillow to have a broader social perspective, because he's the guy who holds the pillow. He's not going to have a broader social perspective. But I think if you accept that for what it is interesting. Also, I saw a number of reviews of this from people who clearly didn't read the second half, because there are people who contradict each other's views because they were involved in different parts of palace life, so their perspective on things were different. And if you took all of the first group of interviews at face value, then people came out outraged, like saying, of course, Haile Selassie read more. Because someone early on says, oh, he had no time to be reading, but somebody later says he read all the time, right? Because that's what this kind of oral history does. So I think it's important to remember that that's what this is. It's not trying to be an absolute portrait. Now, part of the appeal of most oral histories is that you get these different views from different perspectives. And the problem with this is that all of the voices sound the same. There isn't the variety. Like if you read something like Svetlana Alexievich's Voices from Chernobyl, or any of her oral histories, Last Witnesses, The Unwomanly Face of War, any of them, one of the things that she's capturing is the different voices of different people in different positions, and how they can sound different as they talk about different things or the same thing. And the issue here is that everyone sounds the same, so I think it feels less like an oral history, even though it's clearly framed as this is this person's part, this is this person's part. And some of that has to be this game of telephone, right? So he was walking around with a translator who doesn't speak Polish. He didn't speak Amharic. So he's giving a question that's going to be translated back, that he's going to translate into Polish to publish this, and then it gets translated into English for Anglophone readers. So this has been through such a process that I don't know how much nuance you can expect to have left over without it being essentially rewritten, which is, again, the game of telephone. The other interesting note that people have about this is that some people suggest that he edited this very specifically to mirror things that were happening politically in Poland at the time. And I do not know enough about Polish history to be able to judge any of that myself, but I think that's really interesting in and of itself. But that would make it maybe questionable as a portrait of Ethiopian politics if it is being clearly edited to be commentary on Poland. But I think if you do know more about that, I think that would make this really interesting to read and see what you're noticing too. So that was an interesting one just to approach from the various discussions and arguments that you'll hear about it. So yeah, I think that's well worth reading, but it was less good, I think, than a lot of his other books. Like, I would not say that this was as satisfying a read as Shah of Shahs or Another Day of Life, the one about the Angolan War. A lot of Kapuściński's work you walk away with going, that was interesting in terms of learning facts, but also compelling in terms of literature. And I mostly thought that was interesting and not necessarily compelling. So, and finally, I think the most impressive thing that I've read recently, this is Tadeusz Borowski's This Way for the Gas, Ladies and Gentlemen. This is a series of short stories that are basically autofiction. The character in the stories has the same name as the author, and most of this maps almost one-to-one to what we know about his life, so absolutely autofiction, but brilliant stuff. So the author and the character here was sent to Auschwitz as a political prisoner. A few weeks after they stopped gassing political prisoners, it became exclusively a method of ethnic cleansing. That, of course, still meant that people could be worked to death, starved to death, or executed, though. And this is about his experience over the years living and being this political prisoner, and basically both watching the transports that are coming in, going to the gas chambers, and also living as a worker in these conditions that are both horrific and surreal. And again, this is something that is interesting for the context, but also incredibly compelling as storytelling, and just gutting in ways that are, I was going to say hard to describe, not necessarily hard to describe, but he describes it better than I could, so just read the book. This is fantastic. I think I forgot to mention, this was translated by Barbara Vedder, and just really compellingly written, in addition to being really interesting. And also very depressing because it is autofiction, so you cannot help but think about the fact that the author did eventually, he survived the war, but he killed himself when he was 29. So whenever the character is thinking about mortality, you do kind of have that reality of the author's life in your mind at the same time. But yeah, just absolutely interesting, and I think a perspective on that part of the war that that I don't think you see that much of, because I feel like it's a lot of ethnic cleansing in death camps and then work camps separately, but not the people who were political prisoners being used as workers in a death camp. So that's just a perspective that is less that you see less in popular history now. So that's interesting on its own, in addition to how compelling this is and depressing. So that is obviously the most depressing thing that I've read recently, so we're at the end of this video. Yeah. Absolutely pick that up if you haven't before, because that was really brilliant. If you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought. And yeah, what was the most depressing thing that you read in April? Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.